Greetings, my friends. We are all interested in the future, for that is where you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives. But today, we'll return to the past, to the 1930s to be exact. Here's a quick quiz for you. What does Dracula sound like? If you put on a heavy Eastern European accent, you owe that idea to one man, Bela Lugosi. He was the actor who originated the "I want to drink your blood" stereotype. Even though that's not a line he ever actually said, he did hit us with some similar immortal bangers like, "I never drink." Why?
I never drink. Why?
Another question for you. How does Frankenstein's monster walk? If you imagine the creature stretching his arms out in front of him, you owe that idea to Bela Lugosi as well. Boris Karloff never did that in the films in which he originated the monster, but when Bela played him, the monster had been blinded, and the motion stuck apparently. Last question. What is the name of Dr. Frankenstein's assistant? If you said Igor, you're thinking of Bela again. It was Fritz in 1931's Frankenstein, and there is no assistant in Mary Shelley's novel. And Bela was the first to play the character of Igor in 1936's Son of Frankenstein.
We've been spending a lot of time with Bela Lugosi recently. Dan's been spending a lot of time with Bela Lugosi recently. We watched 22 Bela Lugosi movies, read a couple of books, listened to the excellent podcast You Must Remember This to get a picture of a surprising life. Despite being the definitive version of one of the most famous monsters in all of Hollywood and ridiculously influential elsewhere, our hero for today, Bela Lugosi, lived a remarkably sad, unfulfilling life. He was repeatedly denied roles that he sought out, roles that we think he might have done really well in. Despite playing one of the most all-time well-known roles in the entire history of Hollywood, he was quite the underdog, who we find fascinating because his life includes so many instances, making you ask, what might have been?
I'm Dan.
And I'm Jake, and we're both public high school teachers. Bela Ferenc Detso Blasco, who we know as Bela Lugosi, was born in 1882 in Hungary. He was born in Transylvania, in the part of the country that is now Romania. Bela began acting in 1902 at the age of 20, and for most of his early life, he would augment his acting pay by taking normal manual labor jobs between roles. His first film role was in a silent Hungarian film in 1917, and Bela would make at least 10 movies in the next year or two before he left Hungary. He was also a charter member of the Actors Union there, revealing his left-leaning activities. However, the new communist government in Hungary was quickly overthrown by an invasion of Romanian forces, and many people who had been loyal to the former government met the end of a rope. Actors and other members of artistic professions were murdered for their previous political actions. As a communist on the losing side of a revolution in Hungary, Bela fled his home country for Germany.
Fled is the correct verb there. Bela's name was actually on a physical wanted list of subversive revolutionaries because of his communist affiliations there. He was now a political refugee from an inhospitable home country to which he would never return.
You're Hungarian, aren't you, Mr. Lugosi?
Yes, I am. What I mean, I'm Hungarian by birth. I'm an American now.
Well, why did you leave Hungary?
Political reasons.
In Germany, Bela continued to act, even taking part in an unauthorized Jekyll and Hyde adaptation directed by F.W. Murnau, who would soon direct Nosferatu, the first, although also unauthorized, film adaptation of Dracula. He then left Germany in 1920 and made his way to the United States by working the whole way across the Atlantic as an assistant engineer on a steamship. Bela was even attacked by an angry mob of other Hungarians while at sea, but was able to eventually get to New Orleans, where he entered the U.S. He wasn't welcomed with pomp and circumstance since he was an undocumented immigrant, but friends of his in New York were able to sponsor him so that he was able to get to New York City in 1921 and begin acting there. He worked in the theater and on silent films for some time in New York, but without skills in English, Bela was drawn to other Hungarians, and even helped set up a repertory theater where he worked as an actor, a director, and producer, helping put on work of other immigrant artists.
On the lam from the hostile Hungarian government, Bela became an American citizen in 1931. He spoke patriotically of his adopted country, saying, "I don't take it for granted. I feel I am an awfully lucky person to be an American, and I think that every naturalized American and every person born in this land should kneel every morning and utter a prayer for being an American." That may have been because he had genuine affection for the United States, but it might have been partially the fact that he'd felt betrayed and cast out by his homeland.
But you did become a citizen, didn't you, Doc?
Oh, some time ago, and I'm very glad and happy about it. I can stay here for good.
Once he was famous, Bela was offered to return to Hungary as a special guest, but he denied it, asking if people thought he was that big of an idiot, since they'd certainly kill him if he returned home to Hungary. In his final speaking role in 1955's Bride of the Monster, Bela would use that feeling of rejection and indignation to fuel a great performance.
I have no home, hunted, despised.
Bela spent a few years in New York before settling in California in 1930, where he became a founding member of the Screen Actors Guild, hoping to help other struggling actors like he had recently been. To this day, the Screen Actors Guild, or SAG as you sometimes hear it referred to, is an extremely prominent organization in Hollywood. Through 1931, Bela considered many of his film roles unsatisfying, but he was biding his time, and he was confident that his day would come.
Bela was a good actor. He was charming and magnetic on film. He was described by other actors as being warm and friendly on set, while also being extremely professional. Though we mostly just remember his horror performances, Bela had good comedic timing and enjoyed making people laugh. If you watch any of his filmography, it's so easy to see why he made such a great Count Dracula. He can carry himself with such suave dignity and then turn malevolent with just a cock of an eye or a furrow of a brow. However, what we all saw on screen somewhat clashed with how Bela viewed himself. He saw himself as a handsome leading man, as the kind of actor who only played sexy leading roles, in which he gets the girl in the end.
Well, what type of roles did you play?
Oh, different kind of roles, character, dramatic, romantic.
He was very vain, and he thought that his best movies were the ones where he looked the handsomest. He was also married 5 different times. Bela carried on a year-long affair with one of his co-stars, actress Clara Bow. His wife discovered their affair after they had only been married for 3 days and divorced him as soon as possible. Bela didn't have any pictures of Clara, but he described her from memory to a painter friend of his, who painted a nude portrait of her that hung in his living room until he died. I don't think that's a good thing, but part of me is definitely in awe at the audacity of Bela and the skill of that painter.
In 1927, Bela began playing Dracula in the stage play version of the novel. A director named John D. Williams had seen Bela in 2 other productions and liked his work. Thinking that Lugosi's accent was perfect for the role, Williams convinced producer Horace Liveright to cast Bela in the Dracula production that he was about to stage. Bela nearly turned it down since the part had fewer lines than the previous production he had done, but he eventually accepted. It premiered on Broadway on October 5th, 1927, and it was a hit, leading to a touring version across all the states within the next 2 years. We noticed when researching, Dracula was often billed that time as Dracula, the vampire play, perhaps because Dracula wasn't such a household name at the time. The novel was, after all, only about 30 years old. Bela knew little English at the time and learned the lines for the play phonetically, which is contrary to the myth that he learned the film's lines phonetically. By 1931, he knew enough English to get by.
While playing Dracula on stage, Bela loved the audience reaction that he got. He once wrote a letter to a local newspaper that essentially said, well, that his performance as Dracula was a much-needed service for bored married women to actually feel something for once. He claimed that 97% of his fan mail came from women. Even when playing the murderous vampire, Bela saw himself as less of a killer and more of a lady killer. That was where his destiny lay, as the sexy romantic lead, as the star of the stage and the screen, as the well-respected regal craftsman who would be recognized and revered for his talent and his looks. After playing the Count hundreds of times in the theater over the course of the last 2 years, Bela felt that any filmed version of the role should naturally go to him. Upon winning the part in the then-upcoming 1931 Universal adaptation of Dracula, Bela believed he got the role because of his performance in a play he'd starred in called Arabesque. Bela believed that he had just been so irresistible in that role that the producers had selected him for his sheer sex appeal.
In actuality, Bela was not Universal's first choice for the role of Count Dracula. He might not even have been their second or third choice, with the historical evidence showing that the studio had many other, more famous actors in mind. But director Todd Browning did eventually cast Bela, who had actually worked with him in 1929's The 13th Chair. Although he wasn't exactly a big marquee name, remember, he had played Dracula in traveling and Broadway productions of the play, both of which had been huge hits, so he wasn't exactly a total underdog. It's kind of weird to think that by the time he played Dracula in the movie that we all know, he had already played the Count nearly 300 times on stage. Because Bela so eagerly accepted the role, perhaps too eagerly and quickly, he was paid only $3,500 for the film that would define his career. $500 a week for 7 weeks of work on set. Bela found it a challenge to adjust his performance for a camera that sat right in front of him instead of playing for everyone as far back as the cheap seats, but credited director Todd Browning with finding the right balance on screen.
Real question. Have you seen Dracula? I mean, it's one of those movies that is so ingrained in the public consciousness, you probably don't even feel like you have to see it if you haven't, but you really should. It's phenomenal. Bela was the absolute perfect choice for the Count. He's mysterious and alluring and sinister in all the right measures. The lines that might read as corny as hell today, such as, "The children of the night, what music they make," absolutely land.
Children of the night, what music they make.
Including our aforementioned favorite, "I never drink wine."
I never drink wine.
The costumes and sets are a joy to look at, and the movie moves along at a good clip, coming in at only 75 minutes. Not only is Dracula a stone-cold classic that still holds up today if you try to meet it where it's at, but it also saved Universal Pictures from a financial hardship in 1931, and pretty much established the horror genre in sound pictures. You're really looking at the moment when talking horror was invented, with all its tropes that would follow for the next century.
However, Universal knew that what they had on hand was new, and they weren't sure how audiences would react to the first ever feature-length all-horror talkie. Out of caution, they instead decided to market the film as kind of a gothic romance, emphasizing the intrigue and seduction. Posters read, "The story of the strangest passion the world has ever known." Other materials said, "The crimson kiss of Dracula will thrill you to the core." The marketing that focused on Dracula the lover, rather than Dracula the monster, cemented in Bela Lugosi's mind that he's Hollywood's greatest lover, an idea that he would struggle with for the next 3 decades. Unfortunately, even the immortal Count Dracula has forces beyond his control that would make this a career height that Bela Lugosi would never meet again.
So Dracula was released in 1931 and it became a huge success. In fact, it was Universal's biggest movie that year. Bela was eager to leave the role behind, though, for a number of reasons. He was terrified of typecasting, and rightfully so. In 1930s Hollywood, horror movies were B-movies. That is to say, they were not big marquee names, and they were not desirable. In the imagination of the 1930s movie-going public, there were no good horror movies because horror movies were just bad by definition. So horror writers, directors, and stars did not cross over into mainstream success. Understandably, Bela wanted to avoid being pigeonholed as a horror actor, and was cautious of characters like Dracula that he perceived as character roles in evening clothes. Additionally, Bela was working against racism and xenophobia in Hollywood. In the 20s, 30s, and 40s, anyone who gave off an air of even being slightly foreign was allotted roles as Arabs, which was just peak Orientalism and yellow peril. So you get actors like the Hungarian Bela Lugosi playing mysterious, dangerous, vaguely foreign foreigners. The same thing happened to Boris Karloff, who, despite being an English gentleman, was 1/4 Egyptian. But more importantly, Bela didn't want to be in horror movies because that wasn't where his heart or his destiny lay. He was a lover, not a monster. So he could see himself in lead roles of all the greatest romances and drama films that Hollywood could produce. His fear of typecasting would hurt him almost immediately.
Bela said of typecasting, "The popularity of horror pictures is understandable, although I'm afraid I'm typed by now. I'd like to quit the supernatural roles every third time and just play an interesting, down-to-earth person. One of these days, I may get my wish. Meanwhile, I'll tell any story if it's good." Universal producer Carl Laemmle Jr. wanted Bela to play the role of the monster in his next horror picture, entitled Frankenstein. But Bela was not much about that and reportedly complained, "I was a star in my country and I will not be a scarecrow over here." Instead, he was cast in the loose Edgar Allan Poe adaptation, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, complete with its poster that features a truly deranged depiction of what I can only assume is meant to be Bela's character. In some sources we've read, the part Bela was refusing in Frankenstein was actually a very different monster to the one that Karloff eventually played, being more of an mindless killing machine rather than the tragic Miltonic Satan figure that we eventually saw. The makeup tests reportedly involved making his head about 4 times bigger than it normally was, with stilt-like boots that gave him an extra 12 inches of lift. Either way, Frankenstein was an instant smash and made a star out of the previously unknown Boris Karloff, so Lugosi realized instantly what a mistake he had made. The regret stayed with him, and as a result, he almost never said no to a role ever again.
Let's spend some time with Boris Karloff before we move on, though. Boris Karloff represents an interesting counter to Bela's career in Hollywood. While they both started in much the same place, being relative unknowns who scored hits with iconic career-making roles as Universal monsters, Bela's career would never again reach those heights, while Karloff would parlay that success into interesting, quality roles all the way through the late 60s. Sources are mixed as to whether the public just imagined Bela and Boris as rivals, or whether they thought of themselves that way, but it seems that even though they were friendly in person and worked together several times, Bela likely resented Karloff privately. We know for a fact that he hated Karloff's contract required top billing, and Bela was always therefore listed below Boris. Even in films like The Raven, where Bela is clearly more of the lead character than Karloff was still billed above him. He also hated that the very English Karloff had a contract that demanded a break in the shooting day for an afternoon tea session, which Bela thought was a waste of time.
Remember the xenophobia and racism we mentioned a moment ago? Well, Bela and Boris both played in yellow peril movies, and weirdly enough, both of them were cast in anti-Asian films where they portrayed characters named Mr. Wong. They were different characters named Mr. Wong, with no relationship to each other, so it's an extra peculiar parallel. Not only were they victims of racism, but they also participated in fear-mongering about people from Asia, and everything about it kind of just sucks. We avoided watching any of their yellow-faced roles when researching this video, and we are totally okay with that because they're probably definitely not any good. Bela did some grumbling about his kinda sorta rivalry with Karloff privately, and sometimes phrased things a little peculiarly, like later in life, when he was referring to 2 roles that he played that Karloff had also played, he considered himself to be replacing Karloff in those roles rather than following him in them. Additionally, Karloff said some condescending words after Bela died about horror stars disliking their station, saying that it's a bit like a clown bemoaning that he can't play Hamlet. While we can't prove that he was aiming directly at Bela there, it at least seems like a potshot directed his way.
Bela and Boris appeared in 8 films together over the course of their careers. And the movies aren't all winners, but it's sure great to see 2 icons together. It feels a bit like watching a supergroup like Them Crooked Vultures or Boy Genius play a show. In 1934, they were paired for the first time in The Black Cat, also a Universal movie, and one that has basically nothing to do with the Edgar Allan Poe story that it takes its name from. I would actually consider this the second or third best classic Universal horror film, behind Bride of Frankenstein and maybe Dracula if you care. And both Lugosi and Karloff are dynamite. It's scary, gothic, and has this weirdly ahead of its time 50s or 60s vibe, despite it being made in the 1930s. For once, Lugosi gets a complicated and sympathetic role, while Karloff gets to play smoldering evil. Bela and Boris come across as dedicated rivals, equals in gravitas and talent. They're both fun and electrifying, and its ending is an all-time great one.
Did you ever see an animal skin, Hjalmar? That's what I'm going to do to you now.
In 1936, it was contracted that Bela would return to the role of Dracula in Universal's Dracula's Daughter, starring Gloria Holden in a loose adaptation of one Dracula chapter and the novel Carmilla. Bela was to be paid $4,000 for this film, an increase of $500 from his salary on Dracula. However, as production went on, the Dracula role was excised almost completely from the film, leaving only one shot of Dracula in the finished movie. The Count laying inert in his coffin. But even worse, it's not Bela. It's just a wax figure version of Bela with a stake through his heart. Bela was still paid, though, so he essentially received $500 more to not appear in the sequel to the movie that made him a star. Also, check out Dracula's Daughter. It's really good. It's one of the less seen Universal classic monster movies.
At this point, Bela's career entered a vicious cycle of wearing out the brand. He had bills to pay, including paying for some investments that he'd gotten himself into, and his wallet got so thin that he needed to apply for relief from the Screen Actors Guild when his son was born in 1938, so he needed work that paid. Unfortunately, he was not being offered the types of roles he wanted. For every good movie he made, he acquiesced to doing several schlocky, low-budget films in the 1930s and 40s. That meant going to the Poverty Row Studios. Yeah, that's what they were actually called, and I can't believe it either. Those studios included forgotten little production companies like Monogram Pictures and the Producers Releasing Corporation, or PRC. With slim job prospects and basically nobody offering him a role as the dashing lead, he returned to vampire films over and over again. Bela was professional, though, and worked very hard, sometimes filming 2 films at once, like shooting the comedy International House during the day and the horror film Night of Terror at night in 1933. It's easy to see why Bela's star fell at this point. A lot of these Poverty Row films are just tremendously bad. Like The Corpse Vanishes, a 1942 movie made for Monogram, is bafflingly boring. The pacing feels off as people move slowly and deliver their lines like they're half asleep, even as the film rushes from scene to scene to scene, and most of the sets have a quality that's on par with, like, a local high school theater production.
But Bela did a lot of movies in the 1930s and 40s, and some of them are pretty good. Let's talk about some of the films that can teach us about where Bela was at in his career. One of Bela's best vampire roles was in 1935's Mark of the Vampire, made for MGM and directed by Todd Browning, the same director who helmed Dracula. Mark of the Vampire features Bela as the vampire Count Mora, with Carol Borland as his daughter vampire, and they're both just great in it. Apparently, it's essentially a remake of Lon Chaney's London After Midnight, which is one of the most famous lost films in cinema history. There's a twist, though, because Count Mora isn't actually a vampire. He and his daughter are actors. It's all a ploy to get a man suspected of murder to admit his crimes. Mark of the Vampire is a really interesting film. It's very good despite the fact that Bela only delivers about 2 lines in it right at the end of the film. But its production just has so many mysteries.
Bela's vampire has a sort of dried blood wound on his temple, but its presence is never explained. The film comes in at just 60 minutes, which is just barely long enough to be considered feature length by the Screen Actors Guild. There are accounts of an 80-minute version of the film, but it appears to have never gone to screen. There are competing theories as to why this is, with some saying that it was all due to that unexplained head wound. It could have been a self-inflicted gunshot wound, so censors wanted any dialogue about it cut. Some, including his co-star Carol Borland, say that there was an incest subplot that didn't make it to the final cut, and some say that the editors just ended up leaving lots of exposition and comedy beats on the cutting room floor. In regards to Bela being older and less alluring than his Dracula days, it's pretty clear that the stage makeup was caked on a little heavier and thicker than last time, and he's got a few more wrinkles than in 1931. But he's still at least regal and threatening, and as it stands, it's one of Bela's better non-Dracula vampire films.
Mark of the Vampire.
Before the advent of home video much later, the only way someone could see an old movie in the 1930s was when a studio re-released the film into theaters, which was happening every few years if it was a big hit. Although horror movies had fallen out of style for a while by the late 30s, Universal re-released Dracula and Frankenstein into theaters in 1938, causing a call for more of the monsters. So Bela was back at Universal in 1939 for a third Frankenstein film, Son of Frankenstein. This was the last time that Boris Karloff would play the monster. And who can really blame the guy? Karloff had a bad back, and playing the monster was extremely painful. Each boot for the monster's costume reportedly weighed in at 13 pounds.
Sadly enough for Boris, but good for our boy Bela, Son of Frankenstein is one where Bela actually gets to upstage Karloff regularly. Remember, the assistant character in the original Frankenstein film was a guy named Fritz, played by Dwight Frye, but here, Bela originates the character of Igor. In contrast to our public imagination of him as a cockeyed hunchback, he's actually just a bearded weirdo shepherd with no hunch. Bela would also play the character in The Ghost of Frankenstein a few years later. Ghost of Frankenstein kind of sucks, though. Son of Frankenstein was a hit, even though in our opinion most of the Universal Monster sequels drop off hard in quality. And Bela's Igor is the best part of the movie. For the second time in a decade, Bela had saved Universal in hard times and re-established horror as a genre. With the movie's popularity prompting Universal to sign Bela back on for several more movies, he optimistically said of his contract, "They promised they won't all be children scarers."
1942's Bowery at Midnight was one of Bela's Poverty Row films for Monogram Pictures that seems to have received a lukewarm reception in its day and been forgotten immediately, but it's actually pretty entertaining. In the film, a soup kitchen run by a professor named Dr. Brenner is actually the front for a criminal organization. Bela plays essentially a triple role: the aloof, erudite criminology professor, the kindly and loving face that he puts on for his wife and patrons at the soup kitchen, as well as the criminal mastermind Carl Wagner, who does some really depraved stuff that I thought was genuinely surprising to see in a film from the early 40s. While it has some light horror elements, it's mostly a crime story, which makes for a fun watch when you've only seen Bela in horror movies.
The following year, Bela returned to a very Dracula-esque part in The Return of the Vampire, produced by Columbia Pictures. The part was so similar to Dracula because it was intended to be a Dracula sequel, but because Columbia made it instead of Universal, Bela is playing Armand Tesla rather than Count Dracula. There's a werewolf familiar to do the bidding of Dracula. To do the bidding of Tesla, and Andreas the werewolf is pretty silly. It has a prologue that takes place in World War I, and then most of the film takes place around World War II, in which the vampire, Tesla, returns. It's an interesting enough premise that just doesn't really pan out for most of the movie. Probably because it had a budget of just 1/5 of what Dracula was made for 12 years earlier. The most fun we had watching this film was playing what might have been, wondering if the story would have been better if it had been Dracula returning to stalk Mina and Jonathan Harker decades later. Bela, however, is charming and entertaining as always, especially when his Armand Tesla is impersonating a doctor at a gala. Return of the Vampire would also be the last time Bela received top billing for a Hollywood movie.
Things were looking up for Bela in 1943, though. 70 years prior to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Universal started doing team-up movies with its monster characters to create the first shared movie universe. I'm not sure if it was Universal that first used this term or if people applied to it later, but their monster rally movies had the classic monsters teaming up, starting with Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. Bela would finally return to the role that made him famous. Dracula. Wait, no, he's not playing Dracula. He's playing a different vampire. Sorry, wrong again. He's actually playing Igor once more. Oh, wait, no, hold on. Universal is getting what they wanted way back in 1931. Bela is going to play Frankenstein's monster. The role that he had turned down in the early 30s for the fear of being typecast as a monster, Bela would now step into. A man who had been inescapably typecast and long since left behind his place as the Ryan Gosling of his day. I really wish we could know how Bela felt at this point in his career. Why did he accept the role as the monster? Was it just for the money? Was he just glad to be back at a major studio? The one thing we can be sure of is the fact that the part Bela signed on for is very different from the finished movie that we can watch today.
It kind of makes sense for Bela to play the Frankenstein monster here. In Ghost of Frankenstein, his Igor character's brain had been transplanted into the monster's body, and he was about to go get revenge on the world. But that didn't work as well in practice as it did in theory. Bela just did not fit the monster makeup, and he looks weird throughout the film. Realizing what Boris Karloff already knew, the costume was heavy and aggravated Bela's sciatica. The makeup alone was 35 pounds. The production wasn't just hard on him physically, though. Bela's co-star, Lon Chaney Jr., was a jerk to Bela about his age, calling him Pop just to piss him off. More of a contemporary to Chaney Sr. than Chaney Jr., Bela resented the fact that this little goober was now the new horror hotness in Hollywood, and there are more than a few people who think that Chaney doesn't deserve that position at all because they consider him a miserably bad actor.
The misery was not over once shooting wrapped. When test audiences at the studio heard Bela's dialogue as the monster, they burst into laughter. Scripter Kurt Siodmak, who wrote a bunch of these movies, by the way, recalled, Lugosi couldn't talk. They had left the dialogue I wrote for the monster in the picture when they shot it, but with Lugosi, it sounded so Hungarian funny that they just had to take it out. Once Bela's dialogue was excised from the film, they had no way to explain that his version of the monster was blind and his now iconic walk with his arms outstretched before him just kind of looked unintentionally funny. The worst thing about this movie was not the subpar product, though. It was that Bela began using morphine to deal with his back pain that was caused by the monster costume, which was the start of an addiction that he would have for the rest of his life. By 1944, when Bela was filming Return of the Ape Man, which was the sequel to a low-budget Wolfman knockoff, he was openly drinking on set just to get through the day. And it was sort of an open secret that he was using morphine chronically. While Bela was usually the picture of professionalism, he had an embarrassing moment where the pace of a scene was off, so the director told him to pick up the pace, and he actually went slower. The director then told him to pick up the pace again, and Bela did it even slower, not realizing what a problem it was.
The film rolls were drying up. In 1948, Bela's manager Don Marlowe heard that Universal was putting together a horror comedy using its monster characters, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. He reached out to Universal to secure Bela the role of Dracula, but Universal wasn't interested. Bela hadn't played the Count on film in nearly 20 years. After begging, Marlowe actually called up individual theater owners and asked for how much money Dracula had made them over the years. He sent the figures to Universal's office. He told them straight up that they owed Bela the part. Universal decided to cast Bela a few weeks before production began, and he officially returned to his career-making Count role. The story has apparently been pumped up by Marlowe over the decades, with him and a few others reporting that he was able to get Bela the role just days before production started. But the actual historical evidence shows otherwise. For as strongly as we remember Bela as Count Dracula, it's just wild to me that he only played him twice, with one of those times being Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
This film was a much better experience for Bela than the other recent monster films. The director, Charles Barton, noted that all three of the monsters were the nicest. The real monsters were Abbott and Costello. Bela, as always, took his role of Dracula very seriously. and was thankful that the movie didn't undermine Dracula's dignity this time, saying, "All I have to do is frighten the boys, a perfectly appropriate activity. My trademark will be unblemished." We couldn't find anything about Lon Chaney being a jerk to Bela this time, and the monster is played by Glenn Strange, who is a singing cowboy actor like Roy Rogers, but played the monster a few times. And he's a cool and under-discussed actor in the Universal canon. Critical reception for this movie is pretty mixed, but when we saw it as kids, we really liked it. While producers would use Bela's reputation as Dracula to sell tickets to projects for the rest of his life, even billing him as Bela Dracula Lugosi, Bela would never play Dracula on screen again, and this part of his career was over. While there was no way that Bela could have known that for sure, we believe he strongly suspected.
Summer stock theater was a fad in the United States from about the 1940s to the 1960s, in which families would go to plays in summertime-only venues, sometimes outdoor theaters. These were partially popular because they attracted some big-name screen actors, usually ones who were having trouble getting work in movies and needed to pay their bills. If that doesn't sound like late-period Bela Lugosi, I don't know who it could fit better. In the 1940s, Bela began doing summer stock productions of Dracula, as well as Arsenic and Old Lace, in the role of the mysterious villainous Jonathan Brewster, which is, you might have guessed it, another role that Boris Karloff had done. Even weirder is that Jonathan Brewster has had botched plastic surgery, and the play mentions multiple times that he looks like Boris Karloff.
Look at that puss. He looks like Boris Karloff. No!
Dracula and Jonathan Brewster were pretty much the only two roles that he would do consistently, and boy would he do them consistently. Bela would star for 2 weeks as Dracula in a production in Pennsylvania, and then drive to New York to start playing Brewster in Arsenic just 2 days later. As usual, Bela would get stellar reviews as the Count, even if the production he was starring in didn't. He was constantly working on stage during the summers, even though he was always hoping to try something new. In 1948, Bela tried to hold out for better roles, turning down multiple offers to play Dracula that summer. Privately, he really wanted to do a production of Harvey, the play with a 6-foot-tall bunny that isn't Donnie Darko.
Bela was never offered a role in Harvey, and the summer of 1948 seems to be a sad turning point for him. The roles Bela sought and what he said about his career changed afterward, suddenly embracing Dracula more, and even saying that the novel by Bram Stoker was so rich they could do 5 different movies based on it. He started seeking out horror roles a little more explicitly. Had he accepted that horror was just where he would always be in movies? In an extremely sad episode, Bela was laughed at during a summer stock production of Dracula in Florida. Cast member Constance Kelly recalled, "There was the big scene where Dracula suddenly appears. Lucy is lying on the sofa, and the audience is supposed to scream when Dracula appears. Then he leans over to bite her, and the curtain comes down. The set was black and dark, and the light would come on when he would jump up. To do that, Lugosi would crawl from the backstage into the fireplace on the back of the set. He would crawl down to the sofa, then when the light came on, he would stand up, and everyone would scream. Florida is very bright in the summer, very light, and there were lots of windows in the auditorium. So when Lugosi made his dramatic appearance at one performance, they didn't have the blinds pulled. So there he was, crawling across the stage, and the audience knew exactly what he was doing. And there was Dracula crawling. It was a long crawl, and they started tittering, and the laughter got louder and louder, and soon everyone was convulsed. We were too backstage, the actors. Well, poor Bela leapt up, and the audience screamed with laughter. And the light came on, and the audience applauded, and they finished the scene. But poor Bela, he took it so seriously, the part, that he was so very sad. He really wanted to do the best he could. He was so humiliated. I saw him backstage wiping tears from his eyes. Then we were all ashamed, because we had laughed.
Before we get into the final act of his career, we wonder, why was it that Bela, a handsome, talented, professional actor, could have a career that just never really panned out? The first factor to consider is clearly his age. Even back in 1931, when Bela first played Drac on screen, he was already 48 years old, nearly past his window when he could play an attractive lead role. I'm of the opinion that even through the mid-40s, Bela is still handsome and classy, though It'd be a little odd to have him play Dracula into his 60s when the ageless undead count is looking a little wrinkled and his hair is white. It's also a little peculiar in films like Bowery at Midnight, where Bela's wife is played by someone half his age. And in one scene where he's tossing and turning in bed, he looks more like the woman's grandfather than her husband. Bela was always sensitive about his age, and during a screening of The Black Cat in 1956, cried out loud enough for the theater to hear, "Oh, what a handsome bastard I was."
Language was another barrier that was difficult to overcome. Bela always performed in English after leaving Europe when he was young. It seems like he did this for two reasons. He was very eager to leave Hungary behind and never return, mostly for reasons of his own safety, but he also seemed to know that English was where the money and prestige likely was. Actually, quick correction, Bela did perform in Hungarian at least one time that we could find, in the Hungarian language version of King of Jazz, a musical review. There were 9 different versions of the film, each in a different language, and Bela performed the Hungarian one. However, due to a couple of reasons, including being behind the times, the movie was pretty broadly disliked. His thick Eastern European accent, though, was seen as quite the barrier, as we saw when he played the Frankenstein monster. Even though Bela was good in comedy roles, he struggled when comedians improvised, and the famous talk show host Milton Berle once told him, "You kill people on the screen. You also kill jokes." This is one of the most frustrating aspects of Bela's career for us, because while he clearly has an accent, it's just an accent. Nobody bats an eye today about Diego Luna using his natural Mexican accent, or Jermaine Clement using his natural New Zealand accent, or Ana de Armas's Cuban accent. It's just hard to not want to shake the 1930s and tell him to get over it.
At some point in the 40s, when driving through Los Angeles, Bela passed a theater that was showing Dracula, Frankenstein, and Son of Kong, all 3 of which were oldies at this point, as a triple feature for 30 cents a ticket. He saw lines stretching around the block before he saw the marquee and wondered if someone was giving out free food or something, and was shocked when he realized that he was part of the attraction. With nothing else to do, he went home, got his Dracula cloak, and started making public appearances for free before Dracula played. Each night, he got standing ovations.
In addition to theater, Bela had begun putting together traveling vaudeville-style shows in the late 40s. They featured mostly comedy acts, as vaudeville did, but the closer every night would be Bela, doing scenes from Dracula. Bela would do scenes with one other performer, his wife, playing the helpless female victim. Unfortunately, vaudeville acts moved quickly. That was the nature of the format, just a few minutes for each performer and then on to the next one, as quick as can be. That made it difficult for a horror act to prosper. Bela's scene was probably only about 10 minutes from start to finish, and a few minutes was hardly enough to establish eerie atmosphere, let alone scares. It seems like the only genuinely effective part of the act was a prehistoric jump scare, where Bela would appear as Dracula, and then the theater would kill the lights immediately. People shrieked. But due to changing tastes in entertainment and the fact that Bela's Dracula had essentially been memed to death at that point, audiences weren't afraid of Dracula anymore. The vaudeville show widely attracted teenagers who came to laugh at an old man.
In 1953, Vincent Price's House of Wax was released. Now, Bela Lugosi is not in House of Wax, but the producers of the film knew that Bela was in dire need of income. They hired him, cheaply, to stand outside the premiere of the film in his Dracula costume, dark glasses, and with a man in a gorilla suit, which he held by a chain. Several photos were taken at the event. A reporter interviewed Bela and asked the prearranged questions out of order, which confused Bela, who, as we have already noted, struggled with English sometimes, had a drug addiction, and at this point was getting much older. Bela was embarrassed, and then to make matters worse, someone spilled milk on him, embarrassing him further. And Bela left without staying to see the movie.
In the early 1950s, Bela hadn't acted in a Hollywood movie in 3 or 4 years. He even asked the Screen Actors Guild to end his membership due to a lack of work. But then, Bela began hanging out with Ed Wood, who was later dubbed the worst filmmaker of all time. Ed, who Bela referred to as Eddie, was introduced to Bela by Ed's roommate and was such a huge fan that he became a fast friend. Ed was a producer, director, editor, and occasional actor, what we might today call an auteur. But Ed's thing was that his movies were cheap, like 3-day shoots cheap. Ed Wood films are incompetently made in every meaningful way, with visible production elements to inane dialogue and cardboard-thin scripts and performances, not to mention the literally cardboard flimsy sets.
Eros, the Earth people are getting closer to that which we fear. Since they will not listen or respect our existence, they cannot help but believe our powers when they see their own dead walking round again, brought about by our advancement in such things. As soon as you have enough of the dead recruits, march them on the capitals of the earth. Let nothing stand in your way. Their own dead will be used to make them accept our existence and believe in that fact.
But they're trying so sincerely that it's hard not to enjoy them. Because of their charms, Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space is one of my favorite bad movies of all time. Also, Ed Wood is my favorite Tim Burton movie. Fight me, Nightmare Before Christmas crowd. Ed offered Bela roles in his movies, starting as an oddly omniscient narrator in Glenn or Glenda. I mean, he's actually not even really a narrator. There's a whole other narrator who actually narrates. Bela just provides esoteric monologues every now and then, growling, "Pull the string."
Pull the string. Dance to that. Which one is created for?
Glenn or Glenda is a fascinating movie. Most of it's a conversation between two psychologists, acted out by Ed and his girlfriend at the time. Ed plays Glenn, who cross-dresses, much to the chagrin of his fiancée, but he wins her over in the end. In some ways, it is remarkably progressive for 1953 and how it makes some pleas for understanding about something close to what would eventually be called LGBT rights. Bela's parts are wild, though. The film oscillates between all the entertainment value of a driver's ed instructional video to horrifying Lynchian nightmares narrated by Bela's rants. The "Beware of the Great Green Dragon" is something I couldn't get out of my head for days.
Beware, beware, beware of the big green dragon that sits on your doorstep. He eats little boys, puppy ducktails, and big fat snails. Beware, take care, beware.
Also, it has one of the scariest versions of the devil I've ever seen on film. Something about Ed was able to draw pretty interesting performances from Bela. He played a mad scientist alongside another Ed Wood regular, Tord Johnson, in Bride of the Monster, which is mostly a stinker, but has one of the absolutely coolest posters to ever feature Bela's name and one of the best monologues he ever delivered. Remember when he fled Hungary in fear of persecution, never to return? Remember when he hit the big screen hoping to prove his talent to the whole world? Remember how that didn't work out how he hoped it would?
Now I am here, sent to bring you home.
Home. I have no home. Hunted, despised, living like an animal. The jungle is my home. That I will show the world that I can be its master. I will perfect my own race of people. A race of atomic supermen which will conquer the world.
It would be Bela's final speaking role.
The jury is still out on whether Ed Wood was a genuine friend to Bela in his final years, or if he was a parasite bent on sucking money and star power out of the aging actor. When Ed had a payout from a movie, he always paid Bela first. But was that because he cared for Bela, or was it because he knew that if Bela couldn't afford his morphine and went into withdrawal, that they wouldn't be able to film anything? Ed helped Bela make a public plea to help him get off drugs, and was even visited in the hospital by Frank Sinatra, who wrote him a check despite having never met Bela before. But did Ed see it as just a publicity opportunity? Bela Lugosi Jr. is of the opinion that Ed was basically committing elder abuse. Bela seemed to have been suspicious of Ed Wood's motives at times too. When Bela and his fifth wife, Hope Leninger, got married in 1955, Ed drove them to a hotel over the Los Angeles County line for their honeymoon. They got 2 rooms, one for Bela and Hope, and one for Ed, so he could drive them back in the morning too. Ed awoke in the middle of the night to Bela standing over him, wiggling his fingers like Dracula hypnotizing a victim, asking Ed what he wanted with Hope. When Ed convinced Bela that he didn't want anything with Hope, Bela went back to bed.
With Bela's health clearly declining, Ed had shot some footage of Bela in his Dracula cape, stalking around in front of Tor Johnson's house for planned movies The Ghoul Goes West and The Vampire's Tomb.
I was looking forward to work again.
I understand that.
I had an assignment playing the star part in The Ghoul Goes West. Yes, and Eddie Woods will be the producer. And
You're going to enter that as soon as you leave here.
Surely.
When Bela died, Ed decided not to move forward with those movies. But very quickly, Ed decided to use the footage he'd shot for the then-in-production Grave Robbers from Outer Space, which censors later forced him to retitle to Plan 9 from Outer Space. In the finished film, Bela makes basically no sense to include, and he feels very disconnected from the rest of the movie, mostly just milling around graveyards in the daytime. Apparently, Ed used every single frame he'd shot of Bela in the final cut. And the film is truly, tremendously terrible and so much fun. It's got visible boom mics, cardboard gravestones, and a plain cockpit that's clearly just regular chairs. Vampira refused to say anything because her lines were so bad, so she just mugs for the camera. And it's got this great, deranged opening narration of Hollywood hack psychic Criswell.
Greetings, my friend. We are all interested in the future, for that is where you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives. And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.
It's up there with The Room in terms of so bad it's good entertainment value.
Bela died in his sleep of a heart attack while taking an afternoon nap on August 16th, 1956, at the age of 73, about 9 months before Plan 9 would make its debut. The 6'1" actor weighed only 140 pounds. His young wife Hope was mostly unbothered, just making absolutely sure he was dead before calling the police. Bela is buried in his full Dracula costume in Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California, and at his funeral, Ed Wood was the lead pallbearer. Nobody can actually know whether Ed was good or bad for Bela, but he does seem to us like he was a friend, if in his own weird way. Ed and Bela were 2 very unique people, and it does make sense that they would be drawn to one another, find camaraderie with a fellow weirdo who, rightly or wrongly, each felt as though they had loads of talent that had gone unrecognized by the world.
Bela was one of only 4 actors who had played Count Dracula for Universal Pictures through the 1930s and 40s. The others were Carlos Villarreal in the Spanish version of Dracula, which was shot at the same time on the sets at night after Bela's shooting day had wrapped. Lon Chaney Jr. played the Count in Son of Dracula in 1943, and John Carradine plays him in House of Dracula in 1945. Those films vary in quality, and the Spanish version of Dracula actually might be the best film there, better than Lugosi's Dracula, since the crew had the luxury of seeing what Todd Browning's shots looked like before they filmed their own. But all of these actors had one thing working against them. They're just not Bela. They can't measure up.
A quick aside, when it comes to on-screen Draculas, Bela has only one peer, and that's Christopher Lee, who played the Count across the Hammer film productions from the late 50s through the mid-70s. Lee's Dracula films range from great to contrived and ridiculous, but there are 2 or 3 stone-cold classics in there. I'm looking at you, Dracula AD 1972, and it's cool that he says at least one line of dialogue, written by Bram Stoker, in every film that he speaks in. While Bela really only played Dracula twice, Christopher Lee played him 9 times, and had a career more comparable to Boris Karloff. Like Karloff, Christopher Lee wasn't tied to any one role for his whole life, but I don't know if you'd be able to say that he avoided typecasting altogether, because he went on to play mostly just villains. His indelible bad guys include Frankenstein's monster, Karis the Mummy, Scaramanga, Lord Summer Isle, Saruman the White, and Count Dooku.
Bela Lugosi was, by pretty much all accounts, a talented, professional actor, a kind person, and an interesting artist. We find it just a little heart-wrenching that his career was stonewalled by forces so out of his control, and it makes us sad that nobody was more aware of that than Bela Lugosi. With that said, there's so much more to Bela than just Dracula, and if you want to dive into his filmography, there is a ton to love here. Outside of the marital infidelity, he's also just a really likable guy. In 1933, after learning that a young fan of his current play was waiting outside the stage door, hoping to get a glimpse of him, Bela had the young boy taken to his dressing room, introduced to the whole cast of the production, and then canceled a dinner reservation to spend the evening with his fan. He started an anti-fascist group during World War II to raise money to fight Nazis and help European refugees. He's such a cool, interesting dude that he deserves to be remembered for much more than a single role.
But what we think about Bela doesn't really matter. What did Bela think of his time on the screen and on the stage? Well, we said he began to embrace horror in 1948, but that seemed to be out of necessity, and struck us as ultimately settling for what he had been dealt. Throughout the years, Bela displayed a remarkable indifference to horror movies, including Dracula, and it just makes us wish he'd gotten the chance to do more. In May of 1948, he admitted to a reporter for the Salt Lake Tribune, "I have no great love for the Dracula character." He said to a St. Petersburg, Florida journalist in 1950 that he didn't really think much of his screen roles as horror performances, saying, "I just make funny faces." And perhaps most definitively, they only think I can scare children. It is bitterly disappointing. Perhaps we should give the last word to Bela himself.
Well, what was your first mystery play?
Well, Dracula,
Or did the role depress you?
very much. Haunted me. I often dreamed of the dead. In the morning when I woke up, I was tired, restless.
Doesn't Dracula ever end for you?
No. Dracula never ends. I don't know whether I shall call it a fortune or a course, but it never ends. I don't know whether I shall brag or complain about it, but Dracula is the only picture in existence in all the world, which since it is revived, since it is made in 1931, it is the only picture which is revived in every city in America every year.